The sentry post overlooks the Johor Strait at 0200 hours on February 8, 1942. The water is 400 meters wide here, narrow enough that voices carry across on the night wind. Private James Weston of the 2nd Battalion, Gordon Highlanders, squints into the darkness. He knows the Japanese are on the opposite shore. They have been there for days, massing, preparing. What he does not know is that in exactly 90 minutes, 23,000 Japanese soldiers will begin crossing in their first wave, and that in 7 days, the largest surrender in British military history will be complete. Singapore was supposed to be impregnable. The British had said so for 20 years. Construction of the Singapore naval base began in 1923, a project that would consume £60 million and transform a swampy peninsula into what planners called the Gibraltar of the East. The base itself sprawled across 21 square miles of reclaimed land and jungle on the northern shore of Singapore Island. 5 dry docks, the largest capable of servicing a 40,000-ton battleship. Oil storage for 1 million tons of fuel. Barracks for 12,000 men. The naval base represented imperial ambition made concrete and steel, a projection of British power meant to deter Japanese expansion and protect the route to Australia, India, and the empire beyond. But the naval base required protection. In 1937, as tensions with Japan escalated, the War Office commissioned a comprehensive defense review. The resulting plan called for a garrison of 34 battalions, 336 aircraft, and coastal artillery capable of destroying any invasion fleet before it reached Singapore's shores. The centerpiece of this defensive network, 5 batteries of 15-inch naval guns, weapons with a range of 28 miles and shells weighing 1,900 pounds each. These guns pointed south and east, toward the sea, because every planner in London and Singapore agreed on one fundamental assumption. The Japanese would come from the ocean. This assumption shaped everything. The gun batteries received armor plating on their seaward sides, but remained exposed to the rear. The beaches on Singapore's southern coast bristled with obstacles and defensive positions. Intelligence estimates predicted a seaborne assault, probably coordinated with naval bombardment, possibly supported by paratroopers. Malaya, the peninsula stretching north from Singapore, received less attention. 500 miles of jungle, swamp, and rubber plantations. Terrain the British considered impassable to modern armies. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival assumed command of Malaya Command in May 1941. He inherited a force that looked formidable on paper. 88,000 men organized into 3 divisions. The 8th Australian Division under Major General Gordon Bennett, the 9th Indian Division and 11th Indian Division, the latter still forming and training. 2 British battalions. Various support units. But Percival knew the reality behind the numbers. Many of his Indian units were newly raised, their training incomplete. Equipment shortages were endemic. The Air Force component, originally planned for 336 aircraft, numbered exactly 158 machines by December 1941, and most of those were Brewster Buffalo fighters, an American design already obsolete before production began. The Buffalo had a maximum speed of 321 miles per hour. The Japanese Navy's Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, 351 miles per hour, with superior range, climb rate, and maneuverability. Percival requested reinforcements. London sent promises and excuses. The war in North Africa consumed resources. The Battle of Britain had depleted fighter squadrons. Singapore would have to make do. What Singapore did receive, on December 2, 1941, was Force Z, the battleship HMS Prince of Wales. Displacement 43,786 tons, and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse, displacement 32,000 tons. Admiral Tom Phillips commanded. The ships represented Britain's commitment to the defense of Malaya and Singapore. The Times called their arrival a powerful deterrent to Japanese ambitions. 5 days later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 8, 1941, at 0100 hours local time. An hour before the first bombs fell on Hawaii, Japanese forces invaded Malaya. Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita commanded the 25th Army. 3 divisions totaling approximately 36,000 combat troops, supported by 211 aircraft and 83 tanks. On paper, Percival outnumbered Yamashita. In reality, Yamashita held every advantage that mattered. His troops were veterans. The 5th Division had fought in China since 1937. The 18th Division, transferred from Shanghai, had combat experience against Chinese forces. The Imperial Guards Division, though less experienced, consisted of hand-picked soldiers who had trained specifically for jungle warfare. The entire army had rehearsed amphibious operations on Hainan Island, replicating the terrain and conditions they would face in Malaya. They came ashore at Kota Baru on Malaya's northeast coast and at Singora and Patani in southern Thailand. The landings achieved complete surprise despite intelligence warnings. Within 6 hours, Japanese forces controlled the invasion beaches and were pushing inland. Within 12 hours, they had secured their first objective, the airfield at Kota Baru, with its stock of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Admiral Phillips took Force Z to sea. His mission: intercept the Japanese invasion fleet, destroy the transports, cut off the landing force from reinforcement and supply. The plan assumed air cover from Singapore. The plan assumed the RAF could protect 2 capital ships operating 300 miles from base. At 1400 hours on December 10th, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted Force Z. At 1100 hours on December 10th, 85 bombers and torpedo bombers from the 22nd Air Flotilla attacked. Prince of Wales took the first torpedo at 1144 hours. The hit jammed her rudder and flooded her outer propeller shaft. She began listing. Repulse maneuvered wildly, her captain throwing the 30-year-old ship through turns that should have torn her apart. For 20 minutes, she dodged everything the Japanese threw at her. Then, at 1220 hours, 4 torpedoes struck her portside in quick succession. She capsized and sank in 6 minutes. Prince of Wales followed her down at 1320 hours. Admiral Phillips went down with his flagship. 840 men died. The Japanese lost 3 aircraft. Churchill would later write, "In all the war, I never received a more direct shock." The sinking of Force Z eliminated British naval power in Southeast Asia. It left Singapore's sea approaches undefended. More importantly, it shattered the assumption that capital ships could operate without air superiority. The battleship era had ended in the waters off Malaya, and with it, the strategic foundation on which Singapore's defenses rested. But the fortress still had its garrison, its guns, and its reputation. Yamashita pushed south with a speed that defied British expectations. His forces advanced not in solid lines but in rapid columns, bypassing resistance, infiltrating through jungle that British commanders had declared impenetrable. The bicycle became the symbol of this campaign. Japanese infantry units carried folding bicycles, 20 pounds each, manufactured by companies like Miyata and Fuji. These bicycles allowed troops to cover 60 miles per day on Malaya's road network, 3 times the pace of marching infantry. When roads were bombed or blocked, soldiers carried their bicycles through the jungle, then remounted on the other side. The tactic proved devastatingly effective. British defensive positions, carefully prepared to block roads and defend towns, found themselves outflanked before they could establish proper fields of fire. Japanese troops would appear behind British lines, severing communications, cutting supply routes, creating panic. Indian and Australian units, trained for conventional warfare, struggled to adapt. Retreat became the standard response, and each retreat surrendered more territory, more supplies, more momentum to the advancing Japanese. The tanks made the difference in stand-up fights. Japan's Type 97 medium tank weighed 15 tons, mounted a 57mm gun, and had armor up to 25mm thick. The British had exactly 0 tanks in Malaya. They had assumed the terrain unsuitable for armor. The Japanese proved them wrong at every river crossing, every roadblock, every prepared position. When a Type 97 appeared, supported by infantry with light machine guns and grenade launchers, British positions collapsed. At Slim River, on January 7, 1942, a Japanese tank column destroyed or captured over 3,000 men from the 11th Indian Division in 3 hours. The Japanese lost 6 tanks. Percival ordered a general withdrawal to Singapore Island on January 27th. By then, Yamashita's forces controlled all of Malaya, 500 miles conquered in 50 days. The Johor Bahru Causeway, a 1,000-meter-long bridge connecting Malaya to Singapore, carried the last British units across on January 31st. Engineers detonated charges, blowing a 70-meter gap in the causeway. The explosion was meant to slow the Japanese advance, give Singapore's defenders time to organize, prove that the fortress could still hold. It proved nothing of the sort. Singapore Island is 27 miles east to west, 13 miles north to south. Total area, 224 square miles, much of it jungle and swamp. the city of Singapore occupied the southern shore, a dense urban area of 500,000 civilians, now swollen to over 1 million with refugees from Malaya. Percival divided his perimeter into 3 sectors. The northern area, defending the coastline facing Johor, went to the 3rd Indian Corps under Lieutenant General Sir Lewis Heath. The western area, covering the northwest coastline, went to the 8th Australian Division under Gordon Bennett. The southern area, defending the city and the supposedly impregnable southern coast, received the lightest defenses. Percival expected the main Japanese assault to hit the northeast, where the causeway provided the most obvious crossing point. He positioned his strongest units there. He kept substantial forces in the south, still worried about a seaborne assault that would never come. This dispersal left his line thin everywhere, strong nowhere. Yamashita studied the problem from the Sultan of Johor's palace, his headquarters overlooking the strait. He commanded 30,000 troops, fewer than Percival's garrison of 85,000. He had no naval support. His artillery ammunition was limited, enough for perhaps 5 days of intensive bombardment. His supply line stretched back through 500 miles of Malayan jungle to Thailand. Everything depended on speed, shock, and the psychological momentum of an army that had not yet tasted defeat. He chose the northwest coast for his assault. The Australian sector, the weakest point in Percival's defense, at 1700 hours on February 5th. Japanese artillery began a systematic bombardment. Shells fell on known positions, suspected positions, anywhere that might hold troops. The guns fired by battery, methodically, conserving ammunition but maintaining constant pressure. At night, the shelling intensified. Sleep became impossible. Australian soldiers huddled in slit trenches and bunkers, counting the impacts, waiting for the assault they knew was coming. It came at 22:30 hours on February 8th. The Japanese had assembled 300 collapsible boats, canvas and wood frames that could be carried by 4 men and launched in minutes. Additional boats came from civilian sources, fishing vessels and small craft commandeered in Johor. The first wave, 5,000 men from the 5th and 18th Divisions, pushed off from the northern shore and began paddling through darkness toward the Australian positions. Australian sentries heard the boats before they saw them, splashing. The creak of oarlocks, whispered commands in Japanese. Flares arced into the sky, and in their harsh light, the Australians saw the Johor Strait filled with boats, dozens of them, hundreds, all coming toward the shore. The Australians opened fire. Bren guns, rifles, mortars. Boats splintered and sank. Men fell into the water. But for every boat destroyed, 3 more made it across. The Japanese landed on the mangrove shoreline, struggled through chest-deep swamps, assembled on dry ground, and attacked. Australian positions held in some places, collapsed in others. Communications broke down. Unit commanders lost contact with their platoons. The front line became a confused series of firefights in darkness, punctuated by the crump of grenades and the rattle of light machine guns. By 0300 hours on February 9th, 10,000 Japanese troops had crossed the strait. By dawn, 23,000. They pushed inland, expanding their beachhead, overwhelming isolated Australian positions. The 22nd Australian Brigade, defending the northwest coast, had been scattered and cut to pieces. Survivors fell back in disorder, abandoning equipment, losing cohesion. Percival faced a choice: counterattack immediately, before the Japanese consolidated their position, or pull back and establish a new defensive line closer to the city. He chose to counterattack. At 1400 hours on February 9th, he ordered the counterattack to begin, supported by the surviving armor, a company of light tanks, old machines with thin armor and machine guns. The counterattack failed. Japanese troops, dug in and supported by their own artillery firing from across the strait, repulsed every assault. The British tanks, exposed on roads without infantry support, were destroyed by anti-tank guns. By nightfall on February 9th, the counterattack had collapsed, and Yamashita's forces controlled the entire northwest portion of the island. Water became the critical factor. Singapore's water supply came from reservoirs in the center of the island. The main reservoirs, McRitchie and Pierce, supplied the city through a network of pumping stations and pipes. As Japanese forces advanced, they threatened these installations. On February 10th, forward, Japanese units reached the western edge of the reservoir system. Percival's engineers reported that if the Japanese captured the pumping stations, the city would run dry within 48 hours. 1 million civilians, 85,000 troops, no water. Percival pulled his forces back into a tight perimeter around the city, abandoning the northern reservoirs. This withdrawal surrendered half the island and placed Japanese artillery within range of the city center. Shells began falling on civilian areas. The refugee camps took the worst of it. Shrapnel killed indiscriminately. Hospitals overflowed. Medical supplies ran low. The first cases of cholera appeared. Yamashita faced his own crisis. His ammunition stocks were nearly exhausted. Intelligence reports suggested Percival still had 70,000 troops, twice Yamashita's actual strength. If the British held, if they forced a prolonged siege, the 25th Army would run out of shells before Singapore ran out of will. Yamashita needed surrender, and he needed it quickly. He ordered a general assault on February 11th. Every unit attacked. The Japanese pushed toward the reservoirs, toward the city, toward the fuel dumps and supply depots that still held British stocks. Australian and Indian units fought back, but without coordination, without reserves, without hope. Each defensive line broke under pressure. Each withdrawal shortened the perimeter, concentrated more troops into less space, created chaos in the crowded streets. On February 13th, Japanese forces captured the Alexandra Hospital. What happened next remains disputed. Japanese soldiers, engaged in house-to-house fighting, entered the hospital grounds. They found wounded British soldiers, medical staff, patients in beds. Some accounts report the Japanese believed the hospital was being used as a fortified position. Other accounts suggest indiscipline and revenge for casualties taken in the approach. The result is not disputed. Japanese troops bayoneted patients in their beds, executed medical officers, killed approximately 200 hospital staff and wounded. Survivors were marched to a nearby building and held overnight. The next morning, most were executed. The Alexandra Hospital massacre was not an anomaly. It was a preview. Percival convened a conference with his senior commanders on February 14th. The situation was detailed with brutal clarity. Water supplies would last perhaps 2 more days. Ammunition for the artillery was nearly exhausted. Fuel stocks were low. Morale had collapsed. Japanese forces controlled 3/4 of the island and were advancing into the city's outskirts. Civilian casualties were mounting. The longer the fighting continued, the worse the humanitarian disaster would become. Some officers argued for continued resistance. Singapore still had troops, still had positions, still had the symbolic weight of British prestige. Surrender would be catastrophic for imperial credibility. Others pointed out that catastrophe had already arrived. The fortress had fallen. The question now was how many people would die before acknowledging that fact. Percival made his decision. At 0900 hours on February 15th, he dispatched officers under a white flag to contact the Japanese command. At 1700 hours, Percival and his staff officers met Yamashita at the Ford Motor Factory in Bukit Timah. The building, a civilian assembly plant converted to a military headquarters, would host the largest surrender in British military history. Yamashita presented his terms: unconditional surrender, immediate cessation of hostilities, all British forces to lay down arms and remain in their positions. Percival attempted to negotiate conditions for the treatment of civilians and prisoners of war. Yamashita cut him off. The surrender would be unconditional and immediate, or the assault would resume. Yamashita knew his ammunition situation. He knew he was bluffing. Percival did not. At 1810 hours, Percival signed the surrender document. 138,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops became prisoners of war. The Japanese had captured Singapore with approximately 10,000 casualties. British losses in the campaign totaled over 9,000 killed and missing. The disparity reflected not just tactical skill, but a fundamental collapse in institutional competence, training, and leadership. The prisoners faced immediate consequences. Japanese logistics had not prepared for over 100,000 captives. Food was scarce, medical care non-existent. The first night after surrender, tens of thousands of men slept in open fields without shelter, without rations, without information about what would happen next. Those with wounds suffered without treatment. Those with illnesses received no medication. The Japanese guards, few in number and overwhelmed by the scale of their charge, responded to confusion with violence. The next 3.5 years would prove worse. Approximately 25,000 prisoners died in captivity. Some died building the Burma Railway, the 258-mile rail line connecting Bangkok to Rangoon, a project that killed between 90,000 and 100,000 laborers total. including both prisoners of war and conscripted Asian civilians. Others died in camps across Southeast Asia, succumbing to malnutrition, disease, and casual brutality. The death rate among prisoners from Singapore exceeded 30%, compared to roughly 4% for British prisoners held by Germany and Italy. The fall of Singapore shattered assumptions that had governed British strategic thinking for 2 decades. The fortress was not impregnable. Naval power could not project force without air superiority. White prestige held no tactical value against determined and well-trained opponents. Jungle terrain did not prevent modern armies from advancing. It merely required adaptation and training. Every assumption had proven wrong. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. That assessment was accurate. The surrender destroyed British credibility across Asia, emboldened independence movements in India and Burma, and demonstrated to the world that European colonial powers were neither invincible nor inevitable. The psychological impact exceeded the military significance. Singapore proved that the empire could lose, badly, to an Asian adversary. The recriminations began immediately. Percival became the scapegoat. Portrayed as indecisive and incompetent, post-war analyses focused on his deployment errors, his failure to counterattack effectively, his refusal to prepare proper defenses on the northwest coast. These criticisms had merit but obscured deeper failures. Percival had inherited a strategic disaster: the decision to defend Malaya with inadequate forces, the failure to provide modern aircraft, the assumption that Singapore could be held without controlling the peninsula to its north. All these were decisions made in London, not Singapore. The Air Force bore particular responsibility. Had Singapore possessed modern fighters in adequate numbers, the Japanese could not have achieved air superiority. Without air superiority, their ground advance would have stalled at the first river line. Vulnerable to bombing and interdiction, the entire campaign hinged on control of the air, and the RAF had ceded that control before the first shot was fired. The Brewster Buffalo squadrons fought bravely and uselessly against Zeros they could neither outrun nor outfight. The naval debacle compounded the air failure. Force Z steaming into combat without air cover represented institutional delusion about the nature of modern warfare. Admiral Phillips paid for that delusion with his life and the lives of 840 sailors. His death removed the most senior naval commander in theater at the moment when naval expertise was most needed. The loss of Prince of Wales and Repulse eliminated any chance of contesting Japanese sea control, guaranteeing that Singapore would face siege without relief. But perhaps the greatest failure was intellectual. British commanders in Malaya fought the campaign they had prepared for rather than the campaign the Japanese presented. They expected a conventional advance along roads, a methodical siege, a recognition of Singapore's defenses as sufficient deterrent to force negotiated settlement. The Japanese offered none of this. They adapted to terrain, exploited bicycles and light infantry to achieve strategic mobility, used tanks in terrain British planners had declared unsuitable, and pressed attacks with a tempo that never allowed British forces to stabilize. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized speed, initiative, and acceptance of risk. Small units operated independently, infiltrating through supposed obstacles, creating chaos behind enemy lines. When they encountered resistance, they bypassed it. When they found weakness, they exploited it ruthlessly. This approach required training, confidence, and junior officers capable of making decisions without waiting for orders. The Japanese had all three. British forces, trained for set-piece battles and tight control, could not adapt quickly enough. The bicycle itself deserves particular attention. Historians sometimes treat it as a curiosity, a quirky detail in a larger story. This misses its significance. The bicycle transformed the strategic equation in Malaya. It allowed Japanese forces to maintain operational tempo despite primitive logistics. It enabled the rapid redeployment that kept British commanders off balance. It solved the mobility problem that should have slowed the Japanese advance to a crawl. A simple technology, properly employed, proved more valuable than complex fortifications improperly conceived. Yamashita understood this. His planning emphasized mobility and shock over firepower and attrition. He knew his army was smaller than Percival's garrison. He knew he lacked the ammunition for prolonged bombardment. He knew that if the campaign became a siege, Singapore's defenses and supplies would outlast his capacity to maintain offensive operations. Therefore, the campaign could not become a siege. It had to be rapid, disorienting, psychologically devastating. The British had to lose before they realized they were losing. The plan succeeded beyond Yamashita's expectations. He anticipated weeks of fighting in Singapore itself. House-to-house combat that would consume his remaining ammunition and leave his army vulnerable to counterattack. Instead, Percival surrendered after 7 days, with most of Singapore's defenses intact, with substantial ammunition stocks still in bunkers, with artillery pieces that had never fired their guns. Post-war interrogations revealed Japanese surprise at the speed of British collapse. Yamashita's staff officers expected determined resistance, feared heavy casualties in urban combat, worried their supply situation would force withdrawal before victory was achieved. The surrender on February 15th came as relief, not triumph. The 25th Army had been on the edge of culmination, the point where offensive capability exhausts itself. Another week of fighting might have stalled the assault, given Percival time to reorganize, allowed for the reinforcements that were even then en route from India and Australia. But another week would also have cost thousands more civilian lives, depleted water supplies beyond recovery, created humanitarian catastrophe amid tropical heat and monsoon season. Percival's decision to surrender, whatever its military implications, prevented that outcome. In the calculus of war, this mercy might count as his only success. The survivors of the siege carried their experiences forward. Some died on the Burma Railway or in camps in Japan, Korea, and Formosa. Others survived to return home, bearing witness to failures that senior commanders preferred to forget. Their testimony complicated the official narratives, revealed the Alexandra Hospital massacre and countless smaller atrocities, documented the systematic neglect and brutality of Japanese captivity. These accounts shaped post-war perceptions of Japan, hardened attitudes during the occupation, and influenced the decision to try Japanese commanders for war crimes. Yamashita himself faced trial in 1945, charged with command responsibility for atrocities committed by troops under his authority in the Philippines. The charges did not include Singapore, where his conduct of operations had been relatively conventional. But the precedent established at his trial that commanders bear responsibility for crimes committed by subordinates even without direct orders, originated partly from outrage over Singapore and the treatment of its prisoners. He was convicted, sentenced to death, and hanged in February 1946, exactly 4 years after his greatest victory. The strategic consequences of Singapore's fall rippled across the Pacific War. Australia, suddenly exposed to potential invasion, pulled its divisions back from North Africa and demanded American protection. India's independence movement accelerated, emboldened by proof of British vulnerability. Burma fell in months, cutting the land route to China and forcing the Allies to supply Chiang Kai-shek's forces by air over the Himalayas. The entire Allied position in Southeast Asia collapsed, requiring years and hundreds of thousands of lives to rebuild. The fortress itself survived the war intact. Its great guns, designed to repel naval assault, never fired at enemy ships. Some were turned around and used against Japanese land forces. But the 15-inch batteries could not depress their barrels enough to be truly effective against ground targets. They stood as monuments to strategic miscalculation, expensive symbols of preparation for the wrong war. Post-war analysis identified the lessons. Air power was decisive. Naval forces required air cover. Colonial garrisons needed modern equipment and training, not just impressive numbers. Defensive strategies based on assumptions about enemy capabilities were worthless if those assumptions proved wrong. Jungle was not an obstacle to trained troops. Bicycles could change campaigns. Technological superiority meant nothing without the doctrine and training to employ it effectively. Some lessons were learned. British and American forces adapted throughout the war, developing the integrated air-land operations that would characterize modern combat. They learned to fight in jungles, to use armor in restrictive terrain, to maintain tempo in offensive operations. The disasters of 1942 taught tactical and operational competence that showed in the victories of 1944 and 45. Other lessons were forgotten or ignored. The pattern repeated in Vietnam, where another Western power assumed technological superiority would overcome determined opposition in jungle terrain. It repeated in numerous counterinsurgency campaigns where conventional forces struggled against adversaries who refused to fight conventionally. The core error, arrogance about the inevitability of victory, proved remarkably resistant to correction. Singapore today remembers the fall through museums, memorials, and annual ceremonies, The Kranji War Memorial lists the names of 24,000 Commonwealth servicemen who died in the campaign and have no known graves. The former Ford factory, where Percival signed the surrender, operates as a museum documenting the occupation years. Fort Siloso preserves some of the coastal batteries, their guns still pointing south toward threats that never materialized. These memorials serve multiple purposes. They honor sacrifice, acknowledge suffering, and provide focal points for national memory. But they also sanitize. The comfortable narrative of brave defenders overwhelmed by superior numbers obscures the truth that Singapore fell because of institutional failures, strategic incompetence, and racial arrogance that assumed Asian opponents could not match European military effectiveness. The soldiers who fought and died were brave. The system that sent them to fight was broken. At 0200 hours on February 8, 1942, Private James Weston stood guard over the Johor Strait. He had been told Singapore was impregnable. He had been told the Japanese could not penetrate Malayan jungles, or he had been told British forces were preparing to counterattack, to push the enemy back, to restore the situation in 90 minutes. Reality would arrive in canvas boats, and every reassurance would prove hollow. He survived the initial assault, survived the retreat into the city, survived the surrender. He did not survive captivity. He died building the Burma Railway in October 1943, another casualty of decisions made in comfortable offices by men who never faced their consequences. His name is on the memorial at Kranji, one among thousands, a life reduced to carved letters and annual remembrance. The fortress fell because fortresses always fall when the assumptions underlying their defense prove false. Singapore's great guns could not stop bicycles. Its naval base meant nothing without ships. Its garrison, however large, could not overcome incompetent leadership and inadequate preparation. The Japanese won because they understood these truths and planned accordingly. The British lost because they did not, and by the time they learned, over 100,000 men were marching into captivity and the empire was marching toward its end.